And just like that, Derek, you can start us off.
Well, good evening. Hello, everyone. Buenas tardes. Hola a todos y todas. We have our program for you today lined up, and we want to get right to it. But before, we're going to talk about interpretation and get you all set up for that. So, tenemos nuestro programa, pero antes de eso, tenemos una instrucción breve sobre la interpretación de nuestros intérpretes, Samantha y Jake.
Gracias, Derek. Thank you, Derek. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Solo voy a compartir mi pantalla rápidamente. Okay. Buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Samantha y estoy aquí con mi cointérprete Jake y nosotros vamos a ser sus intérpretes este día. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Samantha and I'm here with my co-interpreter Jake and we are going to be interpreting for you today. La reunión de hoy va a estar en inglés y en español y hay interpretación disponible para las personas que no hablan los dos idiomas. Today's meeting is going to be in both English and Spanish with interpretation available for those people who don't speak both of the languages. Para comenzar, si usted se une, bueno, solo hablar un poquito sobre la justicia del lenguaje. Nosotros somos intérpretes con un enfoque en esto porque creemos que cada persona tiene el derecho a comunicar y ser entendida en el idioma de su preferencia. And just to give a quick overview of language justice or just an introduction of language justice, we are interpreters with a focus in this because we believe that every person has a right to understand and communicate in their preferred language. Okay. Si usted se une a través de una computadora, en un momento van a activar el sistema de interpretación, pero cuando lo activen, usted va a ver que aparece una imagen de un globo terráqueo en la parte baja de su pantalla, a mano derecha. Usted va a hacer clic a eso y van a aparecer los idiomas disponibles para la interpretación. So once we activate the interpreter function, you're going to see a small globe icon appear at the bottom right hand of your screen with the two language options available today. Después que haga seleccione el globo, va a escoger su idioma de preferencia y también tiene la opción para silenciar el audio original. Luego después de eso va a seleccionar finalizar para ya terminar ese proceso. So you're going to click on the globe icon, you're going to select your preferred language, and then you also have the option to mute original language, and then you're going to click done. Si usted se une a través de una tableta o un celular, su pantalla se va a ver un poquito diferente. En la parte baja a mano derecha de su pantalla va a haber 3 puntos. Va a seleccionar a esos 3 puntos. So if you're joining us through a cell phone or a tablet, your screen is going to look a little different. At the bottom right hand of your screen, you're going to see 3 dots. You're going to click on those 3 dots. And again, y otra vez, van a aparecer los dos idiomas disponibles para la reunión hoy. Va a seleccionar su idioma de preferencia y escoger finalizar or done. Y también, and once you click those 3 dots, you're going to see the 2 languages available today. You're going to select your preferred language, and then you're going to click done. Okay. Solo para comenzar a hacer un espacio bilingüe es una responsabilidad compartida. So making a bilingual space or multilingual space is a shared responsibility. Pedimos primeramente que silencione su micrófono cuando no está hablando. We ask that you silence your mic when you're not speaking. También pedimos que hable a un ritmo moderado y con pausas frecuentes para que las personas intérpretes puedan seguir su ritmo de hablar. We also ask that you speak at a moderate pace and pause often so that the interpreters can follow along with you. Pedimos que si usted es bilingüe, que tome pausas entre los idiomas o entre ponentes. We also ask that you pause briefly between speakers and languages if you're bilingual. Pedimos también que hable una persona a la vez. We ask that one person speak at a time. Si está hablando más de una persona a la vez, es difícil para nosotros entender quién está hablando. If there's more than one person speaking at a time, it's difficult for us to know who's speaking. También en un espacio en línea es difícil también saber quién está hablando, entonces pedimos que diga su nombre antes de participar. Also in remote spaces, sometimes it can be difficult to know who's speaking or sharing. So we ask that if you're participating, that you say your name before you speak. También a nosotros nos encanta el Spanglish, pero es un poco difícil interpretar el Spanglish en espacios donde hay interpretación. Por ejemplo, aquí en línea, los intérpretes están brincando entre los canales de inglés y español. Entonces pedimos que cuando participe, si va a comenzar a hablar en español, siga en ese idioma y que no brinque entre los idiomas. We also ask that you limit your use of Spanglish, just because, I mean, we love Spanglish, but in remote spaces, it can be difficult to interpret Spanglish because interpreters have to jump from one channel to the other. So we ask that if you start speaking in one language, for example, English, that you follow through with your statement in that language. Ok, entonces en este momento pido que todos escojan su idioma de preferencia. Solo como recordatorio, va a haber un globo en la parte baja o los 3 puntos. Entonces seleccionen su idioma de preferencia. And just to start off, we're just going to test out the interpretation function right now. You should go down to the globe icon, select your preferred language, and we're going to test to make sure that the interpreter function is working. Okay, Jake, puedes comenzar a interpretar. Jake is going to start interpreting. I'll say it in Spanish, you say it in English. ¿Me pueden dar un pulgar hacia arriba si me escuchan en el canal de inglés? ¿Canal de inglés, me escuchan? Okay. And now into the Spanish channel. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me in the Spanish channel. Thumbs up if you can hear me in the Spanish channel. Okay. Okay. So thank you so much. Good luck with your event, and I'll pass the mic back to Derek.
Thank you, Samantha. And thank you, Jake, for the interpretation you're going to be doing for tonight. So this evening, I thought it would be good to lead with a little bit of a self-introduction. So my name is Derek Sexton. I am the coordinator of the MAPA's Massachusetts Peace Actions Latin America and Caribbean Working Group. We're a small group of activists in Massachusetts, mostly based in the greater Boston area, that is working to be in solidarity with the popular movements in Latin America and to prevent U.S. foreign intervention in those countries. I'm also a member of the Boston chapter of CISPIS, that is Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. And 2 years ago, I went on a delegation to El Salvador with CISPIS and met Lourdes and other members of COFAPES and learned about the reality there in the current political situation facing political prisoners and their families. So just a quick plug before we begin. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about what we do, whether as MAPA as a committee or as CISPIS, I'm going to put a couple of website for our Massachusetts Peace Action Committee website. Unfortunately, it's all in English, but I do speak and write in Spanish. So if you reach out to me as well, I can send you some more information. So I'm just going to put my email address in the chat, and we will be in touch if you'd like. So I'll leave that there. So now to introduce our topic for tonight for the webinar, because we want to get you to our speakers as soon as possible. The title of our webinar is The U.S. and El Salvador, Parallels on Political Persecution and Mass Incarceration. We have 3 wonderful speakers tonight. The first of which I'm going to introduce is Professor Mneesha Gellman. Dr. Mneesha Gellman is an associate professor of political science at Emerson College. She is the author of many books and articles on the politics of violence in Mexico, El Salvador, and the United States. including misrepresentation and silence in the United States history textbooks, the politics of historical oblivion. Dr. Gellman is also the founder of the Emerson Prison Initiative, which brings a bachelor's degree pathway to incarcerated students in Massachusetts. And she edited 2 books on education in prisons. She's also the past president of Human Rights Section of the American Political Science Association, and she serves as an expert advisor and witness on country conditions in Mexico and El Salvador in asylum proceedings in U.S. immigration courts. She's also a commentator on politics in the media. And so without further ado, Professor Mneesha Gellman, please take it away with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Derek and the whole MAPA and CISPES team for this invitation to get to talk with you tonight. And thanks everyone for attending. I think I successfully shared my screen, so I'm just going to queue up my slides. And I just want to say I really appreciate the language justice folks and the inclusion of that element in this. It's really special, and I don't get to go to lots of events that have that. So it's a really excellent model, and I will do my best to speak slowly. I'm notorious for speaking very quickly, so it's good to remind myself to slow down. So I'm gonna give a little bit more background about me personally, and then look at the political context of what's happening in El Salvador. I've been doing research there for not quite 20 years. I won't say 20 years because it's been since 2008. I started as a freelance journalist, traveling through Mexico and Central America, filing stories on various social movements and issues of politics happening. I was then a PhD student doing doctoral research in El Salvador and Mexico in the 2010s. And then for almost the last 10 years, I've served now in more than 130 cases for asylum seekers. The majority of those are from El Salvador, but also some Mexico cases. And in those cases, I look at issues of gender-based violence, gang violence, state violence, indigenous identity, and other things that have to do with the particular social group that folks are part of that may be connected to an expanded risk of persecution. And I'll talk more about the expert witness role of my work towards the end of the presentation. I also have a long-term focus on carcerality, or the condition of being imprisoned. And as Derek mentioned, I am the founder and the current director of the Emerson Prison Initiative, which works in 2 different prisons in the Massachusetts state system, where we bring a college pathway to folks who are incarcerated. And that I've been working in prison-related educational spaces for the last 20 years. And through that have gone on to look really comparatively at how access to education and access to transformation of the self happens in a variety of contexts, including in prison, and also when it doesn't happen and when human rights are being violated in those spaces. I think I have, let's see, I think I have just a couple more introductory slides. I'm not going to, I will, after I talk, when I am not presenting, I'll just put a couple of the most recent publications in the chat in case folks want to grab them. And actually, I have I'm going to put the op-ed from a couple weeks ago in the chat as soon as I finish, because the US State Department recently released its updated presentation on human rights in El Salvador that has really serious political implications for everyone that does policy work on El Salvador, but particularly of concern to me are for folks claiming asylum from there. So I'll share that after. The last time I was in El Salvador was in December, January of 2024. I went back for about a month to finally be able to take copies of my first book that came out in 2017 and finally got it translated into Spanish back to some of the people that were featured in the book. So the language justice moment had particular resonance because for years I had felt negligent as a researcher in not being able to share back the information I had documented about El Salvador's political reality in English. And so it was really a great pleasure to get to take that book back in Spanish and share with folks. And during that time, that was in the lead up to the second Bukele election. And so I was also doing a lot of interviews with folks about the context of human rights in the country and the democratic erosion process that was happening then. I already talked about Emerson Prison Initiative. There's a website if you want to learn more about me in the Massachusetts context. But where I'm going to focus on in my short time with you tonight is about how democratization, backsliding, and authoritarianism are playing out in El Salvador today. So one of the unfortunate things I have to say when I do talks like this is that I made a mistake in my early scholarship. So as a PhD researcher and in my first book, I called El Salvador a democratizing country because it met the benchmarks of what political scientists look for in using that label. It had had elections that included a change of power in the presidency in 2009. There was generally an expansion in the civil rights that were accessible to people in this window of the 2000s and 2010s. What we have seen in the last, really in the last 5 years has been a significant democratic backsliding or democratic erosion that signals this declining integrity for democracy, so an erosion of the institutions that form the political system in El Salvador. Under President Nayib Bukele, these institutions that constitute standard institutions in a democratic regime have been dismantled to such an extent that many Salvadoranists that study the politics of the country agree that El Salvador can no longer be named democratic. It does not meet the benchmarks, the minimum baseline that are required to use the label of democracy. And I have a 2022 report that is freely available online that I'll put in the chat after, but that names some of those indicators that folks like me use when we make that claim. So the way that the Supreme Court was purged, the removal of the Attorney General, the forced retirement of judges, the reinterpretation of the Constitution. Oops, sorry about that. Let me advance the slide. To allow Bukele's second election in 2024. These are all indicators of the rule of law not being intact and people's rights not being protected. And that's in addition to the longstanding corruption of state actors, including police, judges, military personnel, and others. This democratic erosion has been rapidly facilitated since the state of exception was put into place in March 2022. It's still ongoing. Many of you are maybe quite familiar with this case, but the state of exception has included mass arrests, suspension of many freedoms, including freedom of expression. I have followed very closely the exile and the warrants for El Faro journalists. El Faro is one of the independent journalism outfits that has long been producing stories that have been both critical of the government, but also provided really important information about what's happening in the government and what's happening under the state of exception that was not being made available through government media. And El Faro relocated its home base to Costa Rica, but then many journalists who were still based in El Salvador recently fled the country in the last several months when it was leaked that there were warrants out for their arrest. So the condition of freedom of expression and freedom of the press in the country have been very much under attack. There is a dominant narrative that Bukele promulgates that his approach to security under the state of exception has made the country safer. In my scholarship, and I've published a number of articles pushing back on this, I ask, but safety for whom? And safety through what process? Because as a scholar of democracy, democratization, and democratic erosion, I'm looking at how can we get a democratic product if we don't have a democratic process? And so when I look at things that I know my colleague Lourdes will speak to in detail about, more than 80,000 people have been detained since the state of exception, the way that neighbors can denounce neighbors as being gang connected, that can lead to someone's detainment. And anybody who can remotely be linked to gangs in any way can be detained without question. These are indicators to me that the safety for whom question needs to be asked. So some people in El Salvador may have an increased experience of day-to-day safety, but that is not the case for everyone. And there are very strong class and regional divides into how those experiences of safety are playing out. And I'm very happy to talk more about that in detail in the Q&A. But just briefly, one of my biggest concerns, again, because of who I work with in the asylum hearings, is that women and girls in working class communities who previously were targeted for some of the worst sexual exploitation by gangs are now being targeted, literally sometimes girls from the same families targeted by police and by military personnel who can walk into households and say, you know, the way that gangs used to say, you're going to be my girlfriend or else we're going to, you know, we're going to kill your family members. Now police can say, you're going to be my girlfriend, or I'm going to say that your family's gang connected and everyone's going to be detained. So I've tried through my research to show the way that state actors in some communities and in some circumstances have replaced the function of gangs in terms of maintaining cultures of violence and ultimately a systematic violation of human rights. Okay, I'll leave off the quality of detention because I think Lourdes is very well placed to talk about that. The other myth that I push back against in my work is that the gangs have gone away, that gangs have been somehow eliminated. And in fact, El Faro journalists and others have documented that gangs have simply relocated and reconstituted themselves. So we know that there are very active MS-13 networks happening in Mexico and in Guatemala. In some cases, gang leaders had facilitated exodus from El Salvador to be relocated in those countries and be able to be set up quite comfortably in exile. And so this reduction of gang power is true in some places, but the elimination of gangs has absolutely not been achieved. And the way that the Bukele media empire continues to promote this version of this particular kind of narrative that the state of exception has gotten rid of the gangs is problematic. A big question that I bring myself to gatherings like this one and that I pose to you is, what happens after the state of exception? So states of exception are supposed to be temporary measures in emergency situations, but what happens next? And again, I work with incarcerated people in Massachusetts. Some of our students are serving very long sentences here in Massachusetts. Some people are serving 5 years or 10 years, and then they're going to get out of prison and they're going to be my neighbor, and they're going to be your neighbor. And so what are we doing to invest in the underlying drivers of conflict to address the fact that states of exception or imprisonment can't last forever? And again, in my research, I tried to look at the way that what I identify as a key underlying driver of conflict, of violence, which is unequal access to insufficient resources, that we have to solve that problem to solve violence. We have to look at unequal access to insufficient resources in order to address sustainable to grow sustainable cultures of peace, that just putting everyone in prison is not a sustainable way to address cycles of harm. Okay, I don't know how much time I have left. I feel like I've used a lot of it up. So give me like a 2-minute warning when I need to wrap up, please. I want to briefly talk about the way that El Salvador is being used as a US deportation destination. This was very much in the news around the Quilmar Abrego Garcia case, so many of you may be familiar with it. But just to briefly recap, on March 16th of this year, El Salvador received this deportation flight that had 238 Venezuelans who had been incarcerated in US state and federal facilities, along with Salvadorans, including Quilmar Abrego Garcia, who had various documentation statuses. Some folks had status, other folks were out of status, other people had filed for withholding of removal in immigration court, but their cases had not been resolved. But Trump invoked the 1798 Aliens Enemy Act to do that deportation flight. This is a wartime act that has only been invoked 3 times, including to justify the internment of Japanese people and Japanese Americans during World War II, which arguably was not the proudest moment of the United States. So I think it's worth highlighting just the political impact of that 1798 Alien Enemies Act. The folks who were deported were incarcerated in the CECOT, the Center for Terrorism Confinement, which has gotten a lot of media attention in the last year. They were then in legal limbo, and there was some very awkward international relations back and forth between the US and El Salvador, where at one point El Salvador was saying the people were the US's responsibility, but the US had paid El Salvador $6 million for 1 year of housing the folks that had been deported. So there was some political hot potato happening in terms of who would claim responsibility for them. I published a policy brief with the Immigrant Wellbeing Collective a couple months ago that included a bunch of recommendations, but one of them was that one of my recommendations was that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, should ensure that if people with adjudicated cases and no claims for relief, so people who have been designated deportable by the US government, they should be afforded due process and be sent to their designated country of removal, provided it's the country of nationality or last habitual residence. So this current phenomenon that we have of non-Salvadorans being sent to El Salvador, or people from other countries being sent to South Sudan or to other countries that is not their country of origin, violates all kinds of rights. And so we need to name that as an egregious human rights violation and address it. So I'll just spend a last minute or two talking about the U.S. Immigration Court role. And I do this because whenever I have a platform to speak on this issue, I try to encourage people to think about how they might be able to use their own skills to participate. And thinking about the work that MAPA does, it feels, maybe you have some audience folks who have this kind of expertise. Anyone that has expertise in the country conditions of a place can serve as a country conditions expert. And so I came to this work supporting people in immigration court because I translate my scholarship to this application of real life circumstances. So I study political violence as a scholar, but I can mobilize that knowledge in a different format to be able to apply it to people's asylum cases. So country condition reports educate courts on identity-based risk in structural context. For example, in the last 3 months, I have been flooded with case requests from attorneys representing young Salvadoran men who have tattoos, who may or may not have been gang involved, but have some sort of criminal history, including here in the Boston area, so that they've exhausted most of their potential for relief. And so the attorneys will bring me on to ask what will happen to this person if they are deported to El Salvador. So I talk about the way that social stigma around deportation happens in El Salvador. I talk about the way that tattoos are perceived, and I talk about the conditions of incarceration, both in CECOT, but also in all the other Salvadoran prisons. And I say this because the CECOT has gotten so much attention, but the other Salvadoran prisons similarly have abysmal conditions, and in some cases even worse structural conditions, because they are older and more decrepit and even more overcrowded facilities. So I give voice to the context of what someone's reality might be should they be deported back, and try to marshal evidence-based research to support someone's claim for asylum. And I do say no to a lot of cases because there's more cases than I could possibly ever say yes to. So I'm always looking to recruit more people with country conditions expertise who are able to serve in that role. Okay, I think I'm actually going to skip this slide because I think it's a little bit off topic. I'll just say at the very end, at the very end of the slide, and I'll use this point as a finisher, the state of exception is deinstitutionalizing many of the democratic institutions of El Salvador, but it is reinstitutionalizing impunity. And it is, when I say that, I mean that by degrading the rule of law, really trying to strip away the rule of law from Salvadoran society, what fills the void of how people relate to each other is through things like corruption and impunity. And in much of my writing, I talk about how the culture of impunity, or the lack of punishment and resolution to conflict from the Civil War up to the present day, has continued to shape Salvadoran political culture. And so I have grave concerns that as the rule of law is eroded more and more, and impunity just expands to fill that space, that we are left with this context of extreme corrosion of the potential and the promise for democracy in El Salvador, which is very painful, because it's a place that was on track to democratize in important ways, and it brings me no pleasure to talk about how much that erosion has been enacted under the Bukele administration. Okay, so I will stop there. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll put a couple resources in the chat, but thank you so much for listening, and I really look forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say on the panel as well, and to your questions later.
Thank you, Mneesha. That was very informative, and I think everyone will agree with me in saying that your scholarship is really being put to good use in the Boston area, but also in El Salvador. And we touched on a number of topics that we're going to expand upon. So with that in mind, I want to introduce Lourdes Palacios. Lourdes is the coordinator of the Committee of Families of Politically Imprisoned and Persecuted Persons of El Salvador, known as COFAPES, since 2021, and was previously representative for the Department of San Salvador in the Legislative Assembly from 2006 to 2015, as well as Undersecretary of Participation, Transparency, and Anti-Corruption during the administration of Presidents Salvador Sanchez Seren of the FMLN from 2015 to 2019. She has degrees in education and economics, and is currently a master's student in interculturality at the Pedagogical University of El Salvador. She is a founding member of several civic associations recognized for their work in support of communities and social sectors in the defense of human rights, as well as a proponent in the formulation of public, legislative, and executive policies on the human right to water and sanitation, the law prohibiting metallic mining, women's citizen and political participation, transparency mechanisms, human rights, and democracy. So with that introduction, I want to turn it over to Lourdes, who has a presentation for us to tell us more about her work with COFAPES and about the prison situation in El Salvador. Lourdes?
Muchas gracias, Derek, y gracias a la Acción por la Paz de Massachusetts por permitirme esta posibilidad de dar a conocer ahora la realidad del Salvador. Es un gusto compartir con Mneesha también en esta tarde, y con todos y todas, amigos, compañeras que seguimos en la lucha por la democracia y la justicia social en El Salvador. Bueno, ahora pues yo coordino este comité de familiares de personas presas y perseguidas políticas del Salvador, que nace en julio de 2021, ya tenemos 4 años de existencia, y pues nuestros objetivos en la siguiente, nuestra misión a partir de hace 4 años es promover y defender el cumplimiento de la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos para garantizar la integridad de las personas presas y perseguidas políticas de El Salvador hasta lograr su libertad. Y en la siguiente página también podemos ver el objetivo de COFAPES, que es, por supuesto, lograr la libertad de las personas presas políticas, pero también nuestro objetivo es combatir la judicialización de la política por razones ideológicas en El Salvador, para que prevalezca la justicia. Con estos objetivos y esa misión que nos propusimos hace 4 años, nosotros iniciamos un trabajo a partir de la situación de capturas selectivas que se vino dando en el país desde casi desde finales de la gestión del fiscal anterior y cuando justo iniciaba la gestión de Bukele. Y por eso en la siguiente página podemos ver que para nosotros este fue el punto de partida, al saber que habían personas ya perseguidas, que habían personas también que fueron capturadas en abril del año 2021. Por favor, si pasa la siguiente. Ujú. Y por eso nos basamos en las definiciones que de acuerdo al Estatuto de Roma, lo que se considera la persecución política es la que está expresada como esta discriminación basada en la ideología política de una persona, pero también de grupos en la sociedad que están dando su pensamiento, que están dando la batalla, que tienen otras opiniones y de esta manera son discriminados y son criminalizados. En la siguiente, también estamos planteando para nosotros que la persona presa política, de acuerdo a esta definición del Consejo de Europa, es aquella persona que, bueno, que no tiene garantías fundamentales, que eso es lo que acá en El Salvador se empezó a ver en estas capturas, que se atenta contra la libertad de pensamiento, de conciencia, de religión, la libertad de expresión o información y que no se permite la libertad de reunión o asociación, pero también una persona política, presa política, es también aquella que se le aplica esta medida de entrar a la cárcel, a la prisión, y que es desproporcionada respecto al delito. Por otro lado, si se trata de forma discriminatoria y si los procedimientos son injustos o por motivos políticos de las autoridades de turno. A partir de eso, en El Salvador, la judicialización de la política comenzó por legitimar como un delito la forma de pensar de una persona o por su definición ideológica, y entonces se ha utilizado ahí todo el sistema judicial para que se ponga eso como un delito. Y en la siguiente página vemos también cómo un delito es aquel principalmente lo que se señalan como hechos de corrupción, porque digamos que la sociedad salvadoreña también estaba en aquella práctica de que todos los políticos son corruptos, de señalar eso como una casi definición de aquellas personas que hemos estado en el ámbito público. Pero entonces, ante eso, lo que a partir del régimen de Bukele se hace es que se empieza a señalar, y esto fue desde su campaña política, empezó a señalar aquellos hechos que a juicio de ellos fueron considerados como corrupción y empezaron a crear, a inventar, a fabricar aquellos delitos para que los funcionarios, sobre todo mayoritariamente de izquierda, fueran señalados como personas que habían realizado hechos de corrupción. En la siguiente. En la siguiente página. No, a ver, anterior, perdón. Por eso es que nosotros vemos esos rasgos fascistas y cómo la judicialización de la política o la guerra judicial se han manifestado, al menos en estos elementos que están aquí. Porque aunque él gana la presidencia en el 2019 y empieza a agravarse la situación de persecución política en El Salvador, pero desde el 2021 que se da la concentración de poder, cuando ya está él en el Ejecutivo, ha tenido la mayoría en la Asamblea Legislativa y de ahí cambia en la Corte Suprema de Justicia, eso lleva a esa falta de independencia de los órganos de Estado y por supuesto a tomar las decisiones desde la Casa Presidencial, y las leyes están a favor del régimen gobernante. Empieza una fuerte campaña para desconocer el cumplimiento de los acuerdos de paz. Y de esta manera, la utilización de las instituciones en este proceso, como el caso de la Fiscalía, la sección de probidad, la Corte de Cuentas, son instituciones utilizadas para fabricar esos delitos, esas pruebas, de tal manera que se lleve a las personas a juicios que son con el uso el sistema judicial y llevarlos a la judicialización de la política. De igual manera, instituciones importantes como la Policía Nacional Civil, que surgen con los acuerdos de paz, y la Fuerza Armada, que se diseña desde los acuerdos de paz también en una reducción de la institución para que cumpla su rol constitucional, pero en su lugar, posteriormente, a partir del año 2022, como señala Mneesha, el estado de excepción es ejecutado por estas instancias y son prácticamente la ley en la calle porque son ellos los que deciden a qué personas se llevan y de qué manera se las llevan. Siguiente, por favor. Entonces, el régimen de Bukele no solamente criminaliza la organización y la participación ciudadana, sino que las ha disminuido totalmente. Y con la aprobación de la última ley de agentes extranjeros, esto ha venido también a deteriorar la participación ciudadana y el trabajo que muchas organizaciones y asociaciones realizan en El Salvador. La reforma a la Constitución que se han dado a conveniencia, y esto tanto por el tema de la reelección, pero también por la modificación de todo el sistema electoral. Para nosotros en COFAPES, la reforma al artículo 248 prácticamente es como darle un tiro de gracia a la Constitución, al sistema democrático, al Estado de Derecho en El Salvador, porque si antes este artículo lo que obligaba era a que si había una reforma constitucional en la siguiente gestión, se ratificaba esa reforma y con la discusión y la participación de la sociedad, ahora eso ha quedado anulado porque se puede reformar la Constitución como cualquier ley en cualquier momento y con mayoría simple. La autonomía municipal está en crisis, no solamente que de 262 municipios se redujo a 44, sino que le ha quitado funciones a las municipalidades, la gestión de los residuos sólidos, la gestión de los mercados, la gestión de proyectos, es decir, que prácticamente no está dejando en los alcaldes ninguna de las funciones, sino que las están concentrando desde direcciones, desde Casa Presidencial. La autonomía municipal está, por supuesto, regulada en la Constitución y por hoy eso está siendo violentado también. Hemos visto el despojo de tierras a cooperativas, a propietarios individuales, con el fin de favorecer las inversiones inmobiliarias o la gentrificación en el caso de San Salvador, que lleva al despojo de estas personas que tienen esto como medio de vida. Las severas restricciones a la libertad de expresión, ahí coincido también con Mneesha, de que muchos de los exiliados ahora son periodistas, tanto los del Faro, los de Factum, Radio Bálsamo. La Asociación de Periodistas del Salvador está reportando entre 50 a 60 periodistas que han tenido que irse del Salvador producto de la persecución política. El régimen de Bukele también ejerce impunemente la corrupción. Acá se prohibió prácticamente el acceso a la información pública y se protege a las personas que en su gobierno están ejerciendo esa corrupción y se ha alargado y se ha puesto en mayor reserva la información que antes era pública hasta un 98%. Se restringe también ese acceso a la información pública no solamente en el ámbito del Ejecutivo, sino que también en el Legislativo y en el Judicial. Por otro lado, ha pactado con criminales, ha pactado con los pandilleros y esto ha sido muy valientemente presentado por los periodistas del Faro que muestran cómo se hizo y se utilizó esa modalidad para ganar votos, para ganar elecciones. Pero aquí coincido también con Mneesha que no es cierto que el territorio salvadoreño esté libre de estas organizaciones criminales. Sigue habiendo presencia en los territorios, pero producto de ese pacto ahora es que se considera que la inseguridad se ha reducido. En concreto, el débil Estado de Derecho y en resumen, el quebrantamiento de la democracia es lo que ahora nos mantiene bajo este autoritarismo y bajo estos rasgos fascistas que hoy tiene la sociedad salvadoreña. Las violaciones a los derechos humanos, de derechos económicos, sociales y culturales, derechos civiles y políticos también son impactos que por hoy la población está resintiendo. Y aquí yo quisiera que si avanzamos en la otra página, poder decirles como cuáles son aquellos casos que nosotros identificamos de persecución y prisión política desde finales del 2018 y a inicios del 19, cuando se ponen estos casos de personas que, y debo resumir, son dos expresidentes del país que pues fueron gobiernos de izquierda, dos expresidentes de la Asamblea Legislativa que también fueron personas de izquierda, como el caso de Cifrido, y luego viene una lista de funcionarios, Benito Lara, que actualmente se encuentra preso en las Bartolinas del Centro Judicial Isidro Menéndez. Está en el proceso. A él le van a dar la resolución el 19 de septiembre. Han pedido 18 años para él y miren de lo que lo acusan. Dicen que Benito fue el que pactó con las pandillas para los votos, cuando lo que está probado es que en realidad quien ha hecho esa práctica es el régimen de Bukele. Ahí fueron ellos los que pactaron. Pero aquí le están dando vuelta a la situación, lo que decimos, e inventan esos procesos. El caso del alcalde de Zacatecoluca y sus concejales, de los funcionarios que en el año 2021 dio origen a COFAPE, que fue la orden de 10 personas para capturarlas, que dentro de ellos estaba el presidente Sánchez Serén y ministros y viceministros de sus gobiernos. Pasemos. También siguen acá otros casos que nosotros identificamos y que les damos seguimiento. La siguiente, por favor. El caso de Azocambia, donde el ministro de Seguridad y Justicia, Ramírez Landaverde, de una manera nefasta y real, fue detenido más de 2 años en prisión. Ahora está llevando el proceso en libertad, pero al final todavía no tiene la absolución total, incluidas estas 22 personas de ANDA que no tenían absolutamente nada que ver, más que porque eran personas que trabajaron en el mejoramiento de los centros penales. El caso de los ambientalistas de Santa Marta, que tal vez es el que se conoce en lo internacional por la información que se ha dado de este caso emblemático. El caso de los veteranos como Atilio Montalvo, Pepe Melara, y en el caso de Atilio, gravemente enfermo, así fue llevado a la cárcel, y ha sido el trabajo, la presión, la solidaridad de todas y todos ustedes con sus denuncias que logramos que el compañero Atilio Montalvo por hoy esté llevando su proceso, está en la casa para ser atendido por sus padecimientos, pero al fin y al cabo no ha habido audiencia. Todos ellos están en la fase de instrucción. Hubo capturas ahora en mayo, también, como es lo último que hemos conocido, que es el caso de Ruth, el caso de Alejandro, ambos abogados, Enrique también abogado, y de don Ángel, que es el presidente de la cooperativa, que hoy en el mes de mayo han sido esas capturas realizadas con estas características de presos políticos y más de 150 personas que se encuentran exiliadas, perseguidas, y aquí hay de distintas, digamos, de distintos trabajos en cuanto a la libertad de expresión, en cuanto a la organización, activistas, defensores de derechos humanos, ambientalistas, comunicadores, que en nuestros registros totalizan esa cantidad. Y quisiera que también, bueno, aquí en la anterior, lo que quería mostrarles es que los presos políticos están en Mariona y Salco y en el caso de la occidental de Santa Ana. Esto no es lo mismo que el CECOT, pero sin embargo hay que decir que el CECOT y con digamos, este vil encarcelamiento que sufrieron estas personas venezolanas, el CECOT fue construido en tiempo récord y justamente para ser ofrecido como ese negocio de la cárcel, para que estas personas, que como ha sido la situación, fueron encarceladas sin ningún proceso judicial en tribunales salvadoreños, al fin y al cabo estas personas podríamos considerar que son personas secuestradas por el Estado salvadoreño, porque aquí no tenían absolutamente ningún proceso que enfrentar en el sistema judicial. Más bien fue ese negocio y es producto también de los intereses geopolíticos que Trump y Bukele tienen para que ese centro de confinamiento del terrorismo lo estén ofreciendo y lo estén utilizando de esa manera. Pero estas personas presas políticas no se encuentran en el CECOT, sino en los otros centros penales. Pasemos. La siguiente. Aquí lo que pretendo es que ustedes puedan visibilizar estos rostros de las personas que siguen enfrentando este sistema de injusticia en El Salvador. Unos han sido condenados, otros no. En el caso de ellos dos, pues fueron funcionarios del gobierno de Mauricio Funes. Pasemos. Tari Rivas y el general Munguía Payés. El caso del alcalde de Zacatecoluca, Salvador Iresi, el concejal Denis Córdoba, el exdiputado Jaime Valdés, que han sido condenados a 15 y 18 años de prisión política. Siguiendo. El caso de los veteranos, que recién explico, ¿verdad? Ellos llevan 16 meses en detención, no han tenido ninguna audiencia preliminar, es decir, están, entre comillas, en periodo de investigación. Pasamos. Aquí está también el magistrado expresidente del Tribunal Supremo Electoral, Eugenio Chicas, que fue una persona que modernizó el sistema electoral en El Salvador, que hoy tiene el atraso por esas leyes que se han aprobado y las reformas constitucionales. En realidad, el licenciado Eugenio Chicas es producto de la venganza política que Bukele ejerce contra él, porque le demostró que había generado esos falsos testimonios contra él, y también porque él logró demostrar en la Asamblea Legislativa que era totalmente falso de lo que se le estaba acusando por unos casos, por casos de corrupción. Siguiendo. Estos son los activistas y el abogado Alejandro Enríquez y la abogada Ruth López, que fueron ahora capturados y que se encuentran en ese proceso que la ley ahora determina que no son ni 72 horas ni un mes, sino que son 6 meses, prorrogables otros 6 meses, tal como están los veteranos. Y con la reciente también reforma que ha habido a la ley, estas personas pueden estar entre 3 a 5 y hasta 7 años en la cárcel, tal como están padeciendo las personas que están ahorita en el régimen de excepción, porque se ha alargado otros 2 años el periodo de investigación. Así que la gente que está bajo régimen de excepción le están aplicando esas desproporcionadas cifras de estar en la cárcel, cifras de días y de meses de estar en la cárcel, y también a ellos se les está aplicando esa misma normativa. Siguiendo. Hay sindicalistas también que están presos, y en el caso de este sindicalista Giovanni Aguirre, no se sabe su paradero, no se sabe dónde está. Entonces él ya ha sido puesto su caso a nivel internacional porque llega a esta categoría de desaparición forzada. Digamos. Aquí hay también las imágenes de los 5 ambientalistas que están señalados por crímenes de lesa humanidad, y en realidad que es un crimen que nadie puede probar que sucedió, porque fue un testigo que dice que le dijo otro. Entonces todo se ha llevado como un chisme llevado a este nivel de gravedad, y para el cual los 5 compañeros ambientalistas pues por hoy también están enfrentando ese proceso y un doble juicio, porque se les volvió a acusar después que ellos habían sido puestos en libertad. Siguiendo. Aquí lo que vamos a ver son rostros de personas que han tenido cargos públicos en el gobierno, en la Asamblea Legislativa, que por hoy están siendo víctimas de la persecución política y del exilio. Siguiendo, ustedes van a reconocer algunos de ellos que están también dentro de los procesos que no están acabados, pero que ha sido el exilio la forma en que se ha logrado proteger su integridad y su vida. Siguiendo. Y aquí hay más rostros del exilio, estos tal vez son más recientes, porque aquí están las compañeras que recientemente han creado la Mesa del Exilio Salvadoreño en México, Berta María, Ingrid y Alicia, que junto con otras 2 personas, otras 2 compañeras, que el caso de Zaira de Cristosal y de la periodista Mónica Rodríguez de Radio Bálsamo, que han debido de salir por esta persecución. Sigamos. Bueno, aquí pues la lista de nuestro registro tiene estos 188, 190 personas que por hoy nosotros registramos. Aquí hay uno de ellos, sigamos, el doctor Zamora, el doctor Olivo, la doctora Sus Rodríguez, Cristina Cornejo también es diputada, Napoleón Duarte, que fue exministro de Turismo, sigamos. Este es, digamos, como lo que nosotros registramos en total, ¿verdad? En este registro que hemos elaborado y que lo hemos ido construyendo a partir de la realidad que las familias también enfrentan. Siguiendo. Yo quiero decir aquí en resumen dos cosas. Una, que la judicialización de la política o esta guerra judicial básicamente ha sido utilizada por este gobierno, que es de derecha. Justamente lo que a nivel latinoamericano se ha registrado es que son procesos que se hacen para fracasar los proyectos revolucionarios alternativos de izquierda o progresista, pero también para eliminar estos liderazgos que pueden llegar a tener una participación en la sociedad y que por lo tanto paralizan la acción de esos líderes. Aquí les han extorsionado con los bienes mediante juicios amañados, les inhabilitan para los cargos públicos también, y la judicialización de la política también infunde ese miedo que junto con el régimen de excepción ahorita son como armas que inmovilizan a la población salvadoreña. Es esta, digamos, la situación que se mira como una vuelta al fascismo que este régimen de Bukele impulsa. Y aquí por lo menos hay un par de, tal vez varias cosas que hay que señalar. Uno, porque ha desculturizado la sociedad salvadoreña, él ha intentado borrar la memoria histórica, eh, tirar un discurso de odio y desconocer los acuerdos de paz. Segundo, porque el autoritarismo que despliega este régimen con la militarización de la sociedad, el control de la población, pero también el control de la función pública, genera ese miedo en la sociedad salvadoreña. Tercero, la represión, pero aquí es con los sectores empobrecidos. Este régimen, esta prisión política, este sistema carcelario que por hoy está asesinando, bueno, hoy veíamos el dato de 444 personas que están de régimen de excepción fallecidas. En el caso de los presos políticos hay 4 que ya fallecieron. Y otro elemento que es como la escalada neoliberal que este régimen de Bukele impulsa porque el tema de los despidos masivos que ha tenido, principalmente en los sectores de salud y educación, el alto nivel de endeudamiento externo que tiene, los intentos privatizadores que hay de la salud a través de esta reciente ley aprobada de hospitales nacionales y de la educación también. Bueno, ustedes saben que está al frente del Ministerio de Educación ahora una mujer que es militar, que es una capitana, que dirige y que ni siquiera ha estudiado la especialidad, ¿no? Sino que es una médica militar que ahora dirige el sistema educativo en El Salvador. Por otro lado, esta persecución política que mostramos en estos hechos, esto que hemos visto acá, la persecución política es mayoritariamente con personas de izquierda, con personas opositoras o progresistas. Si vemos en la otra página, me parece que he puesto esto, que de todo este total, 180 personas son de izquierda, progresistas, de movimientos sociales, sindicales, periodistas ambientalistas, que constituye, de acuerdo a nuestro registro, el 95.7% de personas perseguidas y en prisión. Y solo 8 personas son de un partido de derecha. Aunque hay que decir de aquí que se encuentra el que era el mejor amigo de Bukele, el señor que pues fue asesinado probablemente en condiciones todavía no explicadas, el señor Alejandro Mason. Aquí pues de tal manera que nosotros resumimos también que el desempeño que Bukele ha tenido en toda su gestión, el primer y segundo gobierno, es un desempeño proimperialista, porque tiene esta alianza con el gobierno de los Estados Unidos, con Trump, eh, este avance del fascismo y con estos intentos de que en el continente también otros regímenes se logren alinear desde el fascismo y el sionismo, ha hecho que en El Salvador por hoy tengamos todas estas condiciones en este escenario en el que estamos nosotros en El Salvador. Es la democracia la que está quebrantada y es el Estado de Derecho el que por hoy está teniendo estos resquebrajamientos, que al final, como he dicho, impactan en toda la sociedad salvadoreña y sobre todo en los más empobrecidos. Muchas gracias, compañeros, compañeras, por su atención y su tiempo.
Thank you, Lourdes. That was very informative, and it was interesting for me who haven't really dived into this topic for the past 2 years to see the updated list and roster and some of the updated observations. So with that, we're going to keep moving on to our third and final speaker, who is Yesenia Portillo. Yesenia is a Salvadoran born and raised in California, based in Washington, D.C., where she organizes with local Salvadoran diaspora and allies in solidarity with El Salvador's popular social movement. Yesenia first connected with CECOT in 2010 during its first Radical Roots delegation for Salvadorans living in the U.S. to accompany the anti-mining struggle and to demand justice for water defenders who were killed for their organizing. She currently works for CECOT as their program director. And Yesenia will talk a little bit about the context, the history of CECOT and the current political climate in El Salvador, but also more importantly, she is going to show us how we can take action in the United States to be in solidarity with Lourdes and many others in El Salvador. So Yesenia, go ahead, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. So thank you, Derek, for the introduction. Thank you, Dr. Gellman, for laying the groundwork here. And thank you, Lourdes, for joining us as always and for being such a longstanding leader in the struggle from even before Bukele. So I'm just gonna I wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about obviously that CECOT is an international solidarity organization that was founded in 1980 to really visibilize what the U.S. government was financing at the time, the military dictatorships of that time, and calling for the end of U.S. support for the military dictatorships of that time. And after the signing of the peace accords, continued accompaniment of El Salvador's popular social movement and the political left in El Salvador. So I kind of just want to start by just saying that, I think there's this misconception that I want to address, which is that Bukele is just so widely popular that even continues even until today. So, in the mainstream, we started hearing more about El Salvador, obviously, after Venezuelan migrants were sent to CECOT on March of this year. And we started hearing things like, oh, it wasn't until now that we're seeing people protest in El Salvador, as if people were protesting the Venezuelan migrants. While there was certainly solidarity for that situation, people were continuing to protest for the things they've been protesting for the last 5 or 6 years in El Salvador. So I wanted to share a little bit about that. There was even a very good article that came out today, and there was still kind of this framing about mass popular support. And I think it's really important. We just heard from Lourdes about this really severe political persecution that's been happening since the beginning of this regime. And I think it's really important to recognize the courageous organizing that has been happening even under those conditions and is continuing to happen, and to not invisibilize that as an international community, but actually figure out how to actually be in solidarity with the people that are still on the front lines. And there's efforts coming out from now people in exile, but that's out there. The situation of folks being in exile has been going on for a long time as well. People have been organizing from exile as well. So in this picture, I'm starting off with kind of the biggest march that happened. So even before this, so this was September 15th, 2021, an Independence Day protest that really centered around a very highly unpopular measure inside the country, even though it really put Bukele on the global map, which was making Bitcoin a legal tender in the country. It was actually very highly unpopular. And by that time, there were many other things that people were already protesting in the country. So there were about 10,000 people who took to the streets that year on Independence Day. And there were protests after that as well, just as there were protests before that. But the next one I want to talk about is the peace accords protests that happened in January 2022. And the reason why I want to say these two is because these two dates really have become like days of protest in El Salvador, emblematic dates that have become dates of protest against the Bukele regime in El Salvador, which people weren't really taking to the streets in El Salvador prior to his administration on these days to protest the repressive measures that were happening, you know, because that wasn't the situation. So they've become these emblematic dates of protest. And then I'm going to also fast forward a little bit to May Day 2022. So, you know, in March of 2022 is when the state of exception was implemented, which was just a few months after that really culminating protest on September 15th of 2021. After that protest, we really saw the repression against these protests increase, with police and military blockades set up across the country, trying to prevent people from coming to the marches. But people continue to protest and continue to have protests. So even between that September 2021 protest to the state of exception, there were many protests that continued to happen, but the state of exception was implemented pretty much a few months after that big protest and really has been used since to intimidate the population. So I put this May Day protest here because it was the first mass protest after the implementation of the state of exception. And there were really direct threats coming from the regime saying that if the leaders, the people who were leading those protests, and the leaders of the organizations who were calling people to the streets were gang defenders. And, you know, we have a state of exception now, so you know what that means. So really direct threats, but still there was a lot of concern and fear, but people confronted the fear and still took to the streets in mass protest. And then there's even under these conditions, people have courageously been continuing to take to the streets. And I'm gonna kind of not show pictures of all of the things that people are protesting around, but at the end of 2024, I will say that people were, you know, in June of 2024, Bukele took office for a second term, which is an unconstitutional term. So he's officially a dictator since the Constitution of El Salvador prohibited unconstitutional reelection. It's since been changed in a very illegal manner as well, to allow for indefinite reelection now. But even a consecutive second term is unconstitutional in El Salvador's constitution. So once he took office for a second term, there was a lot of protests again. So there were mass protests by medical and the education sector because of the mass firings that they have been experiencing for years now. But that really culminated at the end of 2024, as well as protests from the Popular Rebellion and Resistance Bloc against the budget and really proposing an alternative budget. Because yes, on the other side, you know, folks have already talked about the neoliberal policies. The IMF agreement that really calls for mass firings in different public sectors is really impacting the population. And then another thing that people really had started to mobilize around in the country was to protest the reversal of the anti-mining ban in El Salvador. So there's a lot of political unity in the social movement around this issue. And it's precisely during this time that, you know, this was closing out 2024. So Trump comes to office. And I think Bukele just feels like it's free reign because even though the Biden administration played its own role in being complicit and silent and really just legitimizing the Bukele administration in their own way, with Trump, we have an intensification. And really all bets are off, and we see an increase persecution happening at the beginning of the year, which I'll get into just briefly in a little bit. But I do want to mention that just a couple of days ago, the movement of victims. Oh, actually, no. Here, this is the one. Sorry, I was looking at the one on my computer. So this slide has photos from the movement of victims of the state of exception, MOVIR, which is an organization that organizes family members of victims of the state of exception, which is, they kind of started self-organizing right off the bat, the family members of victims in different spaces. So Movida is one of them, kind of one of the more visible spaces. There are others. And they've been very bold and courageous in their organizing as well, protesting the Miss Universe pageant that was held in El Salvador, I believe, in 2023, protesting in the Historic Center, going to the Presidential Palace to protest, the Legislative Assembly, etc. And I wanted to kind of also mention but one political prisoner, Fidel Zavala, which is a person that's pictured there, and the lawyers from the UNIDEC, which is the Unit for Human and Community Rights Defense. The two lawyers are currently in political exile, and there is an Interpol red notice against them, and they're being accused of illicit association. And they're an organization that accompanied the movement of victims of the regime and accompanied many communities that are fighting against land displacement. And their current persecution does have to do with their accompaniment of a particular agricultural cooperative called La Floresta. And there's 24 community leaders that have been arrested in relation to that case as well. And Fidel Zavala became a target because he was denouncing the conditions inside the country's prisons. He had been previously arrested under a different, not non-state of exception related situation, but witnessed all of that. And then recently, just this last week, Movir was going to present a letter to the Human Rights Ombudsman of El Salvador, who hosted a sham regional gathering of extreme right-wing parties and entities talking about human rights, a very fascistic move. And they were traveling to this gathering to present a letter, and their bus was intercepted by the police, and the police registered everybody's name. This is a pattern of persecution that Movir and these organizations have been facing. And then I just also wanted to name that again this year, the Popular Rebellion and Resistance Bloc has called for folks to march, and I'm not sure if there's calls from other groups yet, but it is going to be really important for us as international community to uplift that courageous protest that is happening despite this context. Some of the activities, that we have done as CECOT and other allied organizations and groups from the diaspora throughout the years is really accompanying the social movements when they're taking to the streets on these emblematic dates and visibilizing that work. And then I wanted to just share some quick actions. Lourdes talked about this a little bit, which is I kind of just want to point this out because it's not I feel like it's not a very well understood reality, which is that, there's the Salvadoran government says they've arrested 88,750 people under the state of exception. The large majority of them are adults. And all of the adults who have been arrested under the state of exception, and none of them have had a trial, none of them. So while the Bukele regime promotes this model as a model for citizen security, what people don't understand is that no one has had a trial. No one's even had a preliminary hearing because of these extensions that have been given to the Attorney General for the investigative period. So 2 years ago, they were granted a 2-year extension on all the cases. And Movir was calling for that extension to not be further extended. But reforms were passed recently that did give the Attorney General another 2 years on this investigative period, which is why these almost 90,000 adults who have been arrested arbitrarily under the state of exception without access to family visits, lawyer visits, all of them sent to pretrial detention and into the investigative phase pretty much automatically, even though there was evidence of their innocence in a lot of the cases, tens of thousands of cases, are serving years and years and years of pretrial detention, which is what people, I think, internationally are not understanding. So our call to action right now, we do have an organizational sign-on letter that's closing on Thursday, September 11th. So if you are part of any organization that would be interested in signing on, please do that. Or if you know others that you think should sign on, please share the information. We also have a solidarity toolkit that you can find at that link, cspes.org/Movid803. And you'll find graphics and even a zine that you could print out, and all the other, as well as the organizational sign-on letter. And yeah, so kind of moving us into the US and the fact that, as Dr. Gellman talked about a little bit, and I think Lourdes also mentioned, right, what has put El Salvador kind of in the headlines so much recently has been people being sent to CECOT, Venezuelans particularly, but also Salvadorans. So I wanted to share this resource, and I can put all of these links in the chat. And I put this other kind of image because, while people are talking about CECOT, obviously we really need to also be in solidarity with folks on the ground who are continuing to fight the situation in El Salvador. And this resource here, another issue that we want to really sound the alarm about, is the fact that there were Salvadorans who were disappeared into CECOT as well, and they're still in there. So while the Venezuelans were released, there's some dozens of Salvadorans that were sent to CECOT, and we have information about some of these cases that they don't have any gang ties, and so if you go to this website, you'll find the different profiles, but they're mostly of the Venezuelans. But a recent one on September 2nd was added of a Salvadoran young man. And there's other cases like that we want to make sure that when we're doing advocacy, because there's a lot of, I'm going to talk briefly about what's happening in Congress. But, there has been some action from some Democrats in Congress really questioning the agreement between the Trump and Bukele administration, looking for answers about it, denouncing the conditions in the prisons. It's really important to recognize that the threat is really high for Salvadoran deportees to end up in Bukele's prisons. And this is something that was a reality even before Trump. There are examples of people who just were arbitrarily detained on arrival after being deported for no reason at all, because that is the reality in El Salvador. And so deportees have also been faced with this. And kind of continue on along this theme of the US's role. Obviously, something that we haven't really had a chance to talk about right now is just the parallels and the way in which the Trump administration is really using the Bukele playbook and kind of this imperial boomerang that we're seeing on steroids right now between the US and El Salvador. Obviously, the situation with that, brought Bukele into power, there's a lot of ways in which the US played a role in laying that groundwork in terms of saying that the FMLN was just as corrupt as Arena, and the Bukele administration really using that to rise to power. And, while the Trump administration clearly has a very strong affinity, and MAGA had a very strong affinity with the Bukele regime as well, there's a lot of ways in which it's not too much of a departure from what we were seeing under the Biden administration, which really gave the green light to Bukele and really looked the other way and congratulated him when he won the unconstitutional reelection, gave the green light when he was signing up as a candidate, etc., going to visit him. So there's a lot of ways in which that was the background, that was the kind of precursor to what we're seeing now. And there's one thing that I wanted to name, which is that, you know, when Bukele came to meet with Trump, he said that he had liberated, you know, Salvadorans from the gangs. And Trump said, "Oh, that's a good one. I want to use that. Can I use that? Can I take that?" And here we have Trump basically using that same language, that same rhetoric, the same idea of liberating from crime through militarization and repression. And there's so much more that can be said, but I will kind of leave it at that. And there's an action that you can take. So the one thing I will say with regards to Congress is that, you know, they are in a budget negotiation process right now. And the budget that the Republicans are proposing and that the White House is proposing actually celebrates what's happening in El Salvador and increases support, military and security financing to the Bukele regime. So we really need to push back on that and contact our members of Congress and demand that they do everything in their power to negotiate that out of there. And there has been, you know, a very something we wouldn't have seen it before, where the Democrats have aligned fully on certain things in relation to El Salvador, which wouldn't have been the case under Biden. There was a bill, an emergency resolution that was proposed that all Democrats signed onto. So it's definitely important to push back, and there's the action alert there for that. I think that's it. Yeah, and then we have other links with regards to our campaigns to support political prisoners in El Salvador, which you can find at these links as well. So I can put all of these in the chat. But the big ask for today is, you know, if you're part of an organization, sign on to the org sign-on letter. And then the other one being, you know, take this action to contact your member of Congress.
Thank you, Yesenia. I would urge all of us to, before we finish with this call, to just think about the organizations that you're a part of, whether they're churches or civic associations, and circulate those sign-on letters with them so that we can get as many organizational sign-ons as possible, particularly for that first one in solidarity with the Salvadoran Popular Movement. So in the time we have remaining, I want to take some questions from the audience. We probably have time for 2, maybe 3 questions. So if you could just raise your Zoom hand and please keep them to brief questions, not statements, so that we can give as many people as possible a chance to ask the question of our speakers. So I see Mike has his hand raised. Mike, do you want to come off mute to ask your question?
Yeah. So as I'm hearing what's happening in El Salvador, it reminds me of when I listen to Russians talk about not being able to speak freely, Russians who have left Russia. And they say, you know, if they do get accused of a crime, the government has like a 99% conviction rate. So, you know, even if they do go to trial, it's kind of irrelevant. So I'm wondering, are there any parallels with El Salvador where even if the people were to go to court, would they just be convicted anyway?
Mike, can you rephrase that slightly? Are you just asking about in general, about the conviction rate for journalists, or I'm trying to understand a little bit of the question.
Okay, so what I've heard in Russia and a couple other countries, and this sounds like a similar situation, is that when someone in prison, you know, if they're being held and they do go to court, the government has such a high conviction rate that it becomes somewhat irrelevant. I mean, if they're accused, they're going to jail regardless of a trial. Even though in Russia, for example, they do have a trial, but the government, has a conviction rate in the high 90s. So it makes it, I don't know, it just almost, I mean, it's good to have a trial, but
Yeah.
the government always has a 99%
Yep.
conviction rate.
Okay. Yep.
I think
Okay. So
Lourdes could really speak to this because there's definitely cases in which people have been able to prove their innocence, but in some ways, sometimes it doesn't even matter. So Lourdes, I think is probably the best to answer this. But also Dr. Gellman.
Lourdes, you want to start with for answering that question?
Sí, efectivamente, como menciona Michael, es que esto es la judicialización de la política o lo que se llama guerra judicial también, ¿no? Y eso, más la reforma a todas las leyes que ha habido acá de materia penal y ahora también constitucional, lo que hace es poner a las personas en total desventaja para enfrentar un proceso como este que ya está prácticamente cargado a la culpabilidad. El reciente caso de Benito Lara, que les mencionaba al inicio, él ha estado 5 años consecutivos presentándose a firmar, ha llevado todo el procedimiento, no se ha ido del país, él ha estado aquí, enfrenta ahora el proceso judicial y de repente dicen, bueno, usted va a quedar detenido, estando ahí en la sala de audiencia. Pero eso pidió fiscalía, pero el juez dice no, no hay motivo porque él ha cumplido. Lo deja libre. Eso fue el día viernes. El día lunes se reinicia la audiencia y de manera sorpresiva el juez que ya había dicho que él cumplía toda la ley y que no tenía por qué estar en detención, él mismo dice, bueno, usted va a quedar en prisión porque no hay certeza de que usted siga viniendo al proceso. Entonces, ¿cómo cambia una decisión de un día para otro? Y eso es como una muestra de todo lo que aquí ha pasado con las personas que hoy tienen procesos como presos políticos y ahora con el régimen de excepción, que justo esa es una herramienta de control político para el miedo, para que las personas no digan, no protesten, no hagan, para que la sociedad no se organice. Y entonces cuando alguien sale de la prisión, como fue el caso de Fidel Zavala, que dio muestra de cómo era allí adentro, entonces, es claro que la gente no quiere decir nada, ni quiere sumarse como a un movimiento más amplio de protesta, porque saben que caerían en ese gran agujero sin fondo, en el cual no hay ley que pueda sacarlos de ahí, no hay proceso jurídico que los pueda sacar de ahí. Entonces, en los miles y miles de personas que están bajo régimen de excepción enfrentan esto, que son personas inocentes. No estamos hablando de las personas que sí tienen vínculos criminales y con pandillas, pero las personas inocentes. Y los presos políticos tienen como la menor probabilidad porque todos los juicios son, como decimos, sobrecargados a que tiene que señalarse la culpabilidad. Sin embargo, ha habido casos como el de Mauricio Ramírez Landaverde, donde se ha logrado demostrar con la información posible y toda la lucha que se hizo en solidaridad, se les demostró la mentira, se les demostró la falsedad. Entonces ahora no hay resolución judicial, ya van 8 meses, no hay resolución judicial porque no hayan que ponerle. Pero mantienen los casos abiertos. Entonces eso es mantener siempre a la persona en zozobra, en incertidumbre, para enfrentar todos los juicios acá en El Salvador en este sistema.
Thank you, Lourdes. Yesenia, you wanted to respond as well, or?
Yeah, Lourdes did definitely mention it already, and I think one point that is important is that there have been cases of political prisoners that have gone all the way to trial, like the one she just mentioned, and the compañeros have been able to prove that the entire situation was political persecution, including in the case of Santa Marta. So I think that's an important thing, but again, the compañeros from Santa Marta are also being retried. Fidel is being retried, so it's a little bit of definitely more the first thing that Michael mentioned. But when the the compas have courageously confronted the cases, they've been able to prove their innocence most of the time.
Okay, we'll take one more question because we're almost at time. So would anyone else from the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, can you raise your hand? And I think I see we have it's David has his hand raised. So if you go ahead.
Yes, first off, thank you so much for organizing this really powerful event, and thank you to everyone for speaking and bringing light to what's happening and the role we all can play from afar. And so this question is for Dr. Mneesha Gellman. You mentioned earlier, you raised the important question about under the state of exception, with the dominant narrative being that Bukele has quote supposedly eliminated the gangs, and we've talked about the ways that that is not entirely true. You raised the important question about who enjoys safety today, or safety for whom. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, in particular, which particular groups or regions within El Salvador are feeling police or military presence, and why you think that might be.
Yeah, thank you for that that question. And I'll also say I'm sure that Lourdes and Yesenia can add to my answer. You know, when I asked people about their experiences of feelings of security or vulnerability in 2024, 2023, 2024, I heard very class divided responses. So, you know, certainly for me as a foreigner to show up there, I could take Uber all over San Salvador and I felt much safer. So, you know, folks who have skin privilege, folks who have economic privilege and class privilege are definitely experiencing an increase in that kind of like transportation safety moving around the city. And in talking to middle-class Salvadorans who live in communities that do not communities, but in homes that have gates or, you know, significant security fences, folks feel more willing to venture outside of those fences and move around in neighborhoods. Some of the interviews I did with folks in much more working class communities in places like Apopa, where folks had criminal conviction histories, so people that had been incarcerated prior to the state of exception and been released. And those folks were terrified of any sort of state contact because their criminal records, their tattoos, the sort of working class identifiers, especially of male life, was really making them vulnerable to arrest, to someone pointing a finger to say this person, you know, they, even if it was many years ago, they were gang affiliated or their neighbor's a gang member and therefore they should be detained. So the class vulnerability is very high. But I think that it's also neighborhood to neighborhood in places that were more strongly controlled by gangs and now have more strong control by police. And just one very brief example that a human rights worker in San Salvador related to me at the time that I was there, she talked about how the woman that sells tortillas on her street came to her early on after the state of exception and said, oh, everything is so much better. I can walk from street to street selling my tortillas and I don't have to pay the extortion anymore. So I get to keep this extra money at the end of the week. Like I'm doing better economically. 2 weeks later, that woman showed up at her door and said, do you know a place where I can file a complaint? My grandson was just taken by the police and I know he's not a gang member. What do I do? So it's also like a temporal illusion of safety that you're safe until you are personally affected by the state of exception. But I'll leave it there so that Lourdes and Yesenia can add anything that they might want to. But thanks for the question.
Lourdes or Yesenia, would you like to add?
I would like to add, but I want to, Lourdes, no sé si usted quiere también.
Bueno, sí, lo que sucede es que la criminalización es a las personas más pobres. Es decir, allí donde se han generado los cercos militares han sido en las comunidades que históricamente han sido organizadas. Se ha puesto control y militarización en las comunidades. Justo ahora la comunidad del bosque, la cooperativa, está militarizada permanentemente después que fueron los hechos del 12 de mayo y donde se capturó a don José Ángel y al abogado Alejandro Enríquez. Es decir, se criminaliza la acción social y a las personas más pobres, pero no aquellas zonas donde por su condición social, ¿verdad? La élite económica, allí no pasa nada. Allí no entra la policía. Además, son lugares, bueno, aquí se les conoce como residenciales privadas, tienen su entrada, su seguridad propia, y allí no hay seguridad, no hay policía ni hay fuerza armada que llegue a esos lugares. Entonces, ahí es donde miras este tema de las desigualdades del régimen de Bukele, cómo aplica la represión, la persecución política eh, y en general, este miedo que se infunde a la gente de esta condición social. Y de esa manera también los otros efectos que tiene todo el accionar del gobierno, ¿verdad? En términos económicos, de disminución de los programas sociales, prácticamente ha desaparecido la entrega del bono para las personas adultas mayores. Entonces se ha reducido la calidad de vida. Hay 1/4 de millón de personas ahora más pobres que antes del gobierno de Bukele. Y también se han ido para los Estados Unidos, a pesar de las políticas de Donald Trump, se han ido para Estados Unidos en estos 6 años, según los registros mismos del Servicio de Inmigración de Estados Unidos, más de 300.000 personas intentando llegar a los Estados Unidos. Entonces ahí es donde ves que también, por eso cuando nosotros desde COFAPE señalamos este, hiperneoliberalización del Salvador, se está dando porque todo el gobierno ahora está en función de las inversiones de los allegados al clan Bukele, abriendo estos proyectos fracasados como el tema del Bitcoin, pero no viendo las políticas sociales para la gente. Y por eso también la represión, la militarización y la persecución se da para estos sectores, David.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of add what Dr. Gellman was saying with regards to, safety for whom, and the fact that, the middle class sectors were fine and they're fine. That was kind of the situation before Bukele as well, where tourists could come to El Salvador, avoid certain areas, and also feel safe. And so we're seeing the same kind of areas still be impacted by police repression now, though, instead of, these criminal networks or gang, that kind of violence that takes place in marginalized communities. And the other thing I think is really an important thing to name too is, and Lourdes did mention it, is like communities that are historically organized. So what Bukele has done with the state of exception is deploy military sieges in certain specific communities at specific times under certain excuses, right? And that's something that we actually saw even before the state of exception. We saw it during COVID as well. And communities like Chalatenango, for example, were targeted for these military sieges at the time, which is like a historic left bastion of leftist organizing. Then once the state of exception was implemented, they did start going after places that are known for being gang impacted because of the poverty and marginalization that exists there, but then also targeting communities where no gangs have ever existed, really. So communities like Sinquera, Cabañas, Santa Marta, etc. And like Lourdes was mentioning, El Bosque. So there's a parallel there, I think, too, as well. I mean, I know totally different contexts, but what are we seeing in the U.S. right now in terms of what communities are being having the National Guard deployed to them, and for what reasons? Very, very similar, supposedly because they're rife with violence, but they're also Democratic states, or states that vote Democrat. So there's some parallel there, I think, too, to pay attention to.
Okay, if it's all right with you all, we'll take one more question. I know we're over time. Si está bien, Lourdes, tomemos una pregunta más. Okay. So let's see the audience, and this is such a good topic. I want to just keep it going a little bit longer. So anyone that would like to ask a question, just one final question, you can raise your hand. Okay. No more questions? All right. Well, if that's it, I want to thank all of our speakers for the incredible presentations and discussion about the parallels between the United States and El Salvador and mass incarceration and political persecution. Just a reminder about those call to actions that are in the chat. We will also send an email within the next day with all that information so that you can take action, whether you're in Massachusetts or across the country, to be in solidarity with the popular movements in El Salvador. So thank you so much. And I'll just put my contact information again, my email in the chat if you'd like to get more involved or have any other questions for our speakers. You can send me an email and I'd be happy to relay your questions or comments to our speakers. So thank you so much and have a great evening, everyone.
Gracias, buenas noches.
Gracias, Lourdes.